keep working, people. Are we getting there?
Yeah. Run reel 10 again. I think we're duplicating a shot here.
See, a movie doesn't come all on one big reel. It comes on a few.
You got your syncing, you got your editing.
How soon do you think we'll be able to get this cut?
Welcome to the Postcast.
This is Jonathan Norcross, and I'm all alone. I'm completely by myself. I have not a friend in the entire world. No, that's not true. I have friends, but they've all left me. I'm recording this podcast by myself. This is a little bit of an experiment. Usually there are four of us. And you might be asking yourself, where is everybody? Where's Gavin? Where's Jim? Where's that other guy? Well, we've decided to try out recording episodes with just maybe one person or two people, three people, maybe bringing in some guests from time to time. It's all work in progress. This is a good time. We experiment, we throw some stuff at the wall, we see what sticks. So this might be the first of many solo podcasts. It may be the very last one. Who knows? Depends on how I do over the next, I got about 28 minutes. That's all I've been allotted is 30 minutes, by the way. I have a lot to talk about. There's a lot of ground to cover. But Jim, our very talented, very handsome producer, has decided that I only get 30 minutes. The reason, by the way, I only get 30 minutes, in podcasts, you hear people say, oh, we haven't got time for that, or we have to leave. It's like, really? What do you got to do? Where are you going? You going to the club? Like, what are you doing? You can't just finish the thing. The reason is you can only upload a certain amount of time to your thingamajig that hosts the podcast. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but you upload it to a thing. The thing disperses it to iTunes and Spotify and Buzzsprout and these other places. And you only have a certain amount of time allotted per month. So I've been given 30 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this at 30 minutes or as close as I can. But frankly, it's an interesting topic. Sometimes I ramble. And I don't know. I think my voice sounds beautiful. I think it sounds like one person described it as liquid gold. I think that's accurate. All right. So today's episode is called Mumblecore. And guess what? It's about Mumblecore. What is Mumblecore? You might be asking. It's a good question. Not a lot of people have necessarily heard the term Mumblecore. It's a really weird term. It's a term that pretty much no one likes. The people who are considered to be part of the Mumblecore genre or movement, we'll get into the distinction in a second, but the people who consider themselves to be part of it don't like the term Mumblecore. I don't like the term Mumblecore. I think it was invented by some critic. I don't think the critic even likes the term. There have been some other ways to describe this other than just the word Mumblecore. People have used the term bedhead cinema, slackavetties, which is a combination of slacker, as in not slacker as you sit on the couch all day, but slackers in the Richard Linklater film, and John Cassavetes, who is really the iconic American independent film director. So I'm going to tell you what the Wikipedia definition of Mumblecore is, and then I'm going to explain to you why it's totally wrong. So this is what Wikipedia says. Wikipedia says Mumblecore is a subgenre of independent film characterized by naturalistic acting and dialogue, often improvised, low-budget film production, an emphasis on dialogue over plot, and a focus on the personal relationships of people in their 20s and 30s. And then it goes on to list a bunch of the filmmakers associated with Mumblecore. This is why Wikipedia is wrong. And I want to point out that as I'm looking at this Wikipedia page, there's a big thing at the top of the page begging me to give them money. Well, guess what? I'm not giving you money because this definition is horseshit. My big problem with this definition is I don't consider Mumblecore to be a genre. I think it's really odd that you would classify it as a genre. I can't imagine somebody making a movie today, like a new filmmaker making a film in the year 2018, and it hits the festival circuit, and everyone's like, oh, this is a Mumblecore film. I think that would never happen, even if it's very, very similar to other Mumblecore films. I think people would just say, this is a little indie movie. It's a comedy, it's a drama, it's a dramedy. You know, it's got low budget, sort of handheld aesthetic to it. But I don't think anyone would refer to a true, like, independent, low budget film as Mumblecore if it came out today. And that's because I think Mumblecore is a movement, not a genre. The reason I care about this is because, number one, I care about things that are not important. And number two, it's because the whole reason I like Mumblecore is because I think it's a movement. It's a collection of filmmakers who all kind of came up at the same time, all started making movies around the same time, all collaborated with one another. Most of them knew one another. And they all made films that, to one degree or another, are very similar to each other. Either similar in the way that they're made, similar in their subject matter, their themes. You know, there's a common thread throughout a lot of them. And the common threads, the common themes, the fact that they were made in similar ways, and the fact that all these people collaborated with one another make it, in my eyes, very obviously a movement. I don't see how Mumblecore is a genre, but something like, strap in, we're about to get pretentious here, but I don't see how Mumblecore could be considered a genre, whereas like Italian neorealism or the French New Wave are movements. I don't see that Mumblecore is the same thing. It's a group of filmmakers all making similar movies right around the same time. It's a movement. It's not a genre. So now that we've established that Wikipedia is wrong, I'm going to go ahead in the next, whatever I have, 25 minutes or whatever, and talk about some of my favorite Mumblecore movies. I'm not going to be able to talk about every one. I'm not going to be able to talk about every filmmaker. I'm just going to talk about the ones that I like and the ones that I've seen. And I would encourage people, if they watch some of these movies or they think this is intriguing, go out and watch a whole bunch of them. See what you think. You know, don't be afraid. Go out there and spend $3 on a movie rental and let see what you think. My opinions are not always right. Usually they're right, not always. So I'm going to rattle off a whole bunch of Mumblecore movies that I've seen that I like, that I recommend. I'm going to talk about why I like them. In general, my list of films is going to gravitate towards the Duplass brothers, Joe Swanberg, and Greta Gerwig. Part of the reason for that is those are, I think, it's uncontroversial to say so, the most popular, most notable people to come out of the Mumblecore movement. There is one person, you may have heard of her, her name's Lena Dunham, who is kind of part of Mumblecore. Like, she probably would have been had her career not exploded so quickly. But she made a movie in 2010 called Tiny Furniture, which is her big debut, widely considered to be a Mumblecore film. And then she had these small roles in a couple other movies considered to be Mumblecore films, The House of the Devil and Happy Christmas. House of the Devil made by Ty West, Happy Christmas made by Joe Swanberg. And the difficulty is she made Tiny Furniture and then she made Girls and became this enormous cultural sensation. So her career trajectory is very different, say, from the Duplass brothers or from Joe Swanberg, who, even though they had bigger name actors starring in their films after maybe, let's say, 5 years after their big film debuts, they were still making basically independent films, relatively low budget. And, you know, they started attracting, you know, people like John C. Reilly or Anna Kendrick or what's his name? Jonah Hill. Jonah Hill was in the movie Cyrus, directed by the Duplass brothers. They started attracting bigger talent, but the films were still like very much the same. They were a little bit more ambitious in their scope, but they're still relatively low budget independent films that are still in like the Mumblecore tradition. Had Lena Dunham continued on that path, maybe she would be considered more of a Mumblecore person, but she's kind of on the periphery of the movement, in my opinion. Anyway, let's start with the puffy chair.
Remember the puffy chair when we were little?
Yeah.
I found a replica of it on eBay, and I bought it from this dude, and Emily and I were driving in the van to pick it up. and we're gonna bring it to Dad for his birthday.
2005. Duplass Brothers film. It's a great one. It's about a guy who goes on a cross-country road trip with his best friend and his girlfriend. And his goal is to get a big puffy chair. That's basically the plot of the film. His dad's birthday is coming up. And no, sorry, he goes on a road trip with his brother, not his friend. His dad's birthday is coming up, and they want to get him a big puffy chair like he used to have. So they find one that's far away. They get a van. They drive all the way out there to get the puffy chair. It's a road trip movie. It's about the main character's relationship with his brother, which is very strange. At one point, the brother just kind of like marries some random woman, and they have like a big ceremony, and then he leaves her the next day. It's not good. And it's also about the relationship between the main character and his girlfriend sort of slowly falling apart. But it's very funny. It's very creative. And I think it's a good place to start because, number one, it's the first big Duplass Brothers film. And number two, it has a lot of the hallmarks of Mumblecore movies. And certainly has a lot of the qualities that would make the Duplass Brothers so successful. If you've read, by any chance, Like Brothers, it's a book that the Duplass Brothers wrote together. They are brothers, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. In Like Brothers, they talk about this revelation they had early in their career. Their first movie they made was actually not the puffy chair. It was not like one of these sort of handheld kind of DIY, ultra low budget sort of films. They raised a decent amount of money for their first feature project. And they got a real DP and they got real sound people. They had a whole crew of people working for them. And they were very careful to come in on time and on budget. And then they looked at the finished film as they were editing it and thought it was just kind of soulless. It was just kind of boring. It was dull. It wasn't unique. It didn't stand out. It may have been well shot. The way they produced the film may have been, very efficient. They weren't wasting money. They weren't sloppy. They weren't stumbling around. But they were left with a movie that just wasn't that good and that they weren't satisfied with. And then after that, they kind of changed their method of filmmaking. They made a short film, which was that just the two of them made. Literally, Jay Duplass picked up a camera and pointed it at Mark Duplass. Mark Duplass was the actor. And that short film did really well. And it led to them making features like The Puffy Chair. A lot of what makes the Duplass Brothers film so good is not the cinematography. It's not necessarily the acting, although the acting is always good. It's not that there are big stars in their films. Sometimes there are, but not typically. It's not that they're especially well edited or composed or anything. It's all just about the story, the ideas, and the characters. And everything else is kind of serviceable, but it doesn't matter because what they really care about are the ideas, the stories, and the characters. And The Puffy Chair is kind of a perfect example of something that, it has like this like fun plot. They're on a road trip across the country to find a puffy chair. You see a relationship dissolving and all of that. But it's really just like the concept that makes it great. It's not beautifully shot. It's not magnificent to look at. You don't look at it and immediately think, my God, I want to hire this cinematographer. And that's not to insult. Yeah, it looks fine. It looks fine. But it's, it's very DIY. It feels like a bunch of people came up with a great idea and with an extremely low budget, gathered together a group of friends and just went out and made the film they wanted to make. And I think that's what makes not just the Duplass Brothers, but Mumblecore movies so exciting, is you watch them and think, I could make something like this. And by that, I don't mean that, I'm not saying I'm as good as the Duplass Brothers. I'm not. If I was as good as them, I'd be sipping champagne in Beverly Hills or doing something. I wouldn't be sitting here doing this, talking to myself. But what makes them so admirable is that it's all about the idea. It's not about the amount of money. It's not about graphics. It's not about magnificent camera work. It's all about the idea and the script. And really anyone theoretically could come up with an idea like this and could make a movie like this. It doesn't cost that much money. You don't need an enormous crew. You don't need sophisticated equipment. You just kind of need the bare bones of what you need in order to make a film. And you could theoretically make a movie like The Puffy Chair. The difference, of course, is that the Duplass brothers are really clever and they're great at coming up with stories and characters. And the rest of us, remains to be seen. But I love The Puffy Chair, and The Puffy Chair is a great place to start, both if you're interested in Mumblecore and in the Duplass brothers. Next film we want to talk about, Hannah Takes the Stairs.
I just get really frustrated. I get really frustrated because I love things so much, and I feel like what I do is so trite and small.
I'm going to be honest, I don't remember this movie very well. It was written by Joe Swanberg and Greta Gerwig, directed by Joe Swanberg. I think it's notable for having like a whole bunch of Mumblecore people all in one movie. There's the fact, obviously, that Joe Swanberg directed it. There's the fact that Greta Gerwig is in it. Mark Duplass is in it. Rai Russo-Young is in it. It's just kind of one of the early, like, quintessential Mumblecore films, kind of like a calling card of the genre. And probably like the first big role for Greta Gerwig, like the first time people saw Greta Gerwig and liked her and recognized her talent. I think, personally, been a big fan of Greta Gerwig for a very long time. And I think that you don't get to a movie like Lady Bird without Greta Gerwig having, co-written these films with Joe Swanberg. She started out as an actor. She's a great actor. She has a great screen presence. But, these are sort of like the early films where she was developing story ideas. She was developing characters. She was learning how to make films, how to tell stories. And, I think obviously later on when she started collaborating with Noah Baumbach, that was really, when her career and her talent took off. But you can see traces of like her style, her personality in some of these early films that she co-wrote, like Hannah Takes the Stairs. And another movie I really like that came out in 2008 called Nights and Weekends. Also a film directed by Joe Swanberg. Greta Gerwig shares directing credit on this. So I guess she's a co-director, co-writer, and also stars in the film. The movie also stars Alison Bagnall, who is very interesting kind of filmmaker who many years ago wrote a movie called Buffalo 66, which stars Vincent Gallo and Christina Ricci. It's a really strange movie. It's very good. I like it. I think it's kind of hilarious. It's also kind of terrible. And it was the beginning of Vincent Gallo becoming this really eccentric indie filmmaker who is, I would say, overall hated by most people, rightly so. I think now he's basically just kind of like an alt-right, pro-Trump kind of, hell-raising edgelord kind of guy. But he made Buffalo 66, which was a great movie and showed a lot of promise. And then his career just kind of went away. He made a weird movie called Brown Bunny with Chloe Sevigny, which was well known for her maybe not actually performing oral sex on him. That's a discussion for another time. Anyway, Allison was a co-writer of Buffalo 66 and then just kind of did nothing for a long time. Buffalo 66 came out in 98. It wasn't until 2008 that she really sort of came back, and she acted in a couple of Mumblecore films and then wrote and directed a movie called The Dish and the Spoon, which I really like. Very underrated, probably underseen Mumblecore film, which is saying something because hardly anyone watches these movies. So to be an underseen Mumblecore movie, it's like, I don't know, like 20 people probably watched it. It's great though. The Dish and the Spoon stars Greta Gerwig and Ollie Alexander. But Nights and Weekends, great film, very like intimate drama about a man and a woman trying to maintain a long distance relationship. Doesn't really pan out beautifully. These things tend not to. But it's a great film. And again, also, if you like Greta Gerwig, if you like Frances Ha, Mistress America, Lady Bird, this is like a good example of her kind of finding her voice back in the day. The film came out in 2008. Also a movie that came out in 2008. Probably my favorite. I don't know if it's my favorite Mumblecore, but it's up there. It's called Baghead.
Oh, Matt, that's really scary. This is a game? Someone just came into my room with a bag over their head and your clothes on. Tell me that was you.
Look, if one of you is messing with us, you just better fess up right now.
Catherine, did you go into her room?
No, I didn't. Then somebody saw me naked.
Naked?
Took my battery. Oh, that's scary, Chad. Bring out the chainsaw. Let's do it.
It's a really weird, unique combination of like a horror movie, little bit of a drama, definitely a comedy. It's about a group of kind of out-of-work actors who all go to a cabin in California, and they decide that they're going to write a screenplay. They're going to like hold themselves up in a cabin and write a big screenplay that they can all star in, and that's going to be their big break. And then the film just kind of like, it winds up just becoming a horror film. It's sort of like the story they're coming up with begins to come true. It's really unique. It's really strange. And yeah, it's definitely in my top 5 Mumblecore films. Highly recommend Baghead. Also stars Steve, oh Christ, I don't know how to say his last name. Steve Zissis. Zissis. He's been in a whole bunch of Duplass Brothers projects since then, including their HBO series Togetherness, Chef Who Lives at Home, Cyrus. He's kind of like a staple in Duplass Brothers films. And Greta Gerwig in this movie as well. Highly recommend Baghead. I think Baghead gets points for being one of the most unique films I'm going to mention, in the sense that a lot of these movies are kind of like intimate, personal dramas and comedies about relationships and friendships and, you know, midlife crises and that kind of thing. Baghead is a really unique blend of genres. It's towards the end of the film just a straight up horror movie. It's sometimes incredibly funny, and then at other times it's this heartfelt drama about a group of people who are just kind of like hanging on by a thread, trying to make their dreams come true. Really strange film, but I love it. Baghead, great movie. Next film I want to talk about is a straight up horror movie. It's called The House of the Devil.
Hi, I'm calling in regards to the babysitter flyer posted outside my dorm.
Tonight's big eclipse is now well underway.
I feel a little weird just dropping you out here in the middle of wherever we are.
You have to forgive me, Samantha, because I've not been completely honest.
We're from the desert, you know.
You see, we actually don't have a child.
They lied to you.
I know, okay, I know you're right. But it's $400. This equals first month's rent and then some, and all I have to do is sit inside and watch TV. This is huge. This one night changes everything for me.
Really good, kind of slow burn horror film written and directed by Ty West. If you believe Wikipedia, and you shouldn't because they lie, but if you believe Wikipedia, House of the Devil is a quote unquote Mumblecore movie, which just like, come on. I just consider it to be a Mumblecore film because it was part of this wave of films that were made around this time. Ty West has collaborated with a bunch of other Mumblecore people. Greta Gerwig's in this film. Lena Dunham has a very quick little cameo in this film. Ty West has collaborated with Joe Swanberg and a bunch of other people. But House of the Devil, very low key, but I think very good little indie horror film. Relatively simple concept. Kind of a throwback to a 1980s babysitter horror film where she's babysitting a kid, supposedly in this giant house. And guess what? It's the House of the Devil. Scary. Spooky stuff happens. Greta Gerwig is very good. She plays like the friend at the beginning of the film, and it's a great little supporting role. Next movie I want to talk about, Cyrus.
So John, I have to apologize to you.
What?
I mean, you came in and I sat you down and I just started blabbing all about my life. I get overly excited sometimes, and I apologize. I honestly am curious to hear about you.
Well, let's see. I'm an editor.
I don't want to know what you do. I want to know what you are, who you are.
We're really gonna. You want me to? What? Okay. I'm divorced. It wasn't my idea. It was, I got left, and been in kind of a dark existential place, to tell you the truth. And then I met your mom at a party, and I don't know, things are looking up for the first time in a long time.
So, are you gonna stay the night?
Maybe we should ask your mom. I don't know.
I think that's between me and Chuck. Okay.
That's just...
Enough said.
We did have sex.
Cyrus came out in 2010. Duplass Brothers movie. This was made 2 years after Baghead, 5 years after Puffy Chair. So Cyrus is kind of like and this is why some people think Mumblecore ended in 2010, because this is the Duplass brothers making a film that's for a little bit more of a wider audience. And having said that, Cyrus is weird. Cyrus is a film that, if it didn't star John C. Reilly, Jonah Hill, and Marissa Tomei, if it just starred sort of the normal crop of Duplass brothers actors, I don't think it would be any different from any of their other Mumblecore films. But because it stars these higher profile actors, I think there's probably more pressure on them to make a film that's more accessible to a wider audience. I don't think it really works. I'm not a tremendous fan of Cyrus. Cyrus is very strange. It's not a bad movie. It's not like it's not worth watching, but it just doesn't have the cleverness or the charm of, say, a movie like Baghead. It's not nearly as unique. And I don't know. I think maybe people saw Cyrus as like evidence that the Duplass brothers couldn't quite get over, sort of cross that line from micro budget indie darlings to just like straight up writer directors of romantic comedies or sort of dramedy films. And I don't know, it's an okay movie. If you want to see sort of the Duplass brothers doing something that's more conventional, that's more mainstream friendly, I would recommend Togetherness, which was a HBO series that they wrote and directed for 3 seasons. It's great. Togetherness is really like the Duplass brothers maintaining a lot of what makes them so unique, maintaining a lot of the themes and the characters from like their early films, but doing it on a little bit of a bigger scale with a bigger cast, with a little bit better known actors, obviously a bigger budget since it's an HBO series. But Cyrus is notable just because it's 2010 is like the year that Mumblecore went from being a tiny little sort of movement of filmmakers that were whispered about to becoming more of like a thing. The Duplass brothers started becoming more of a, I don't want to say household name, that's a little much, but people started talking about the Duplass brothers a little bit more. And more mainstream, actors and producers started noticing their work as a result of Cyrus. Again, not a fantastic movie, but notable, I think, for kind of the separation between the early years of Mumblecore and then the later years when it kind of blew up, or at least certain people in the movement blew up. Also, another film that came out in 2010, Tiny Furniture, written and directed by Lena Dunham. Maybe you've heard of her.
I think that I may be the voice of my generation.
Tiny Furniture, I already sort of talked about how, Lena Dunham, had she continued on a different career path of being more of like an indie writer-director as opposed to jumping right away to an HBO show. It's interesting to think of where her career would have gone. I really liked, personally, Tiny Furniture. I don't like Girls very much. There are like episodes here and there of Girls that I think are okay, but I'm not a tremendous fan. I do love Tiny Furniture, though. I remember thinking it was great. And I remember thinking that, Lena Dunham was someone who's going to sort of follow on the trajectory of the Duplass brothers or Joe Swanberg and continue to make, these relatively low budget, sort of comedy dramas, maybe sort of moving forward step by step by getting these bigger name actors in her films. But instead, she kind of went from this right to Girls. And a lot of people love Girls, so maybe that was the right move. But sometimes I just wonder if her career had gone down a different path of sticking with writing and directing indie films for a few more years. Would that have changed who she is? Would that have changed her work? Would it have changed how she's perceived? Interesting thing to think about. Moving on. Another movie that came out in 2010, another film that sort of bridges the gap between the early years of micro-budget Mumblecore and then Mumblecore becoming a little bit more mainstream. The movie Greenberg, written and directed by Noah Baumbach, stars Ben Stiller, Greta Gerwig, a bunch of other people. Mark Duplass, I think both of the Duplass brothers have a quick cameo in this film. Noah Baumbach is definitely a Mumblecore fan. Probably the most obvious evidence of that is, well, number one, the fact he's collaborated with Greta Gerwig a whole bunch of times, but then also the fact that he made the film in 2012, which we'll talk about later, Frances Ha, which was co-written and starred Greta Gerwig. The title of that film, Frances Ha, is a throwback to a Mumblecore film that I'm not really talking about too much on this podcast, but it's called Funny Ha Ha. So Frances Ha is kind of a throwback to that title. Noah Baumbach, I think, was definitely enamored by the Mumblecore movement and collaborated with Greta Gerwig, who's obviously a product of the Mumblecore movement. And Greenberg was their first big collaboration together. It's an okay movie. Having said all of that, it's just sort of a film where Ben Stiller is depressed and he goes to this big house in Los Angeles and he kind of mopes around, and Greta Gerwig, who's kind of like an assistant caretaker for his wealthy brother, hangs out with him and for God knows what reason kind of dates him for a little while. It doesn't go too well. It's a weird film, but again, notable because 2010 was kind of the year that Mumblecore blew up, and is also the start of the collaborations between Baumbach and Greta Gerwig, which would be very fruitful in the years to come. We'll talk about that soon. Moving on, The Innkeepers came out in 2011. Don't have too much to say about this. This is Ty West's follow-up to The House of the Devil, but I saw it at the Woodstock Film Festival. I liked it. They gave me a free t-shirt. It was nice. That's all I have to say about The Innkeepers. Another film that came out in 2011 is called You're Next, directed by Adam Wingard, who's gone on to make all sorts of horror movies. I think his most recent one was kind of like a reboot of the Blair Witch Project. We won't talk about that on this podcast because I'm trying to be nice here. And I didn't love that film. But Your Next is straight up horror film. It stars a bunch of people who belong to the Mumblecore movement, like Ty West, like Joe Swanberg. And it's a very unique horror movie. I recommend it. It's a lot of fun. Other than the reboot of Blair Witch Project, I think a lot of the stuff that Adam Wingard has done over the last 2 years has been really cool, including VHS, which is, for those who haven't seen it, go watch VHS. It's great. It's a series of short horror films, each one by a different director. It's awesome. Adam Wingard also directed The Guest, great movie that came out in 2014. Also did Death Note for Netflix, which I haven't seen, but therefore I have no comment on. Dish in the Spoon, film that came out in 2011. Mentioned it a little bit earlier. Alison Bagnall, who co-wrote Buffalo 66 and then disappeared for a while, kind of came back as like a Mumblecore filmmaker. I like The Dish in the Spoon. It stars Greta Gerwig and Ollie Alexander. And I think it's most notable for an exchange they have about Thanksgiving, which is very funny.
I don't really understand Thanksgiving. Like, what? I thought you annihilated the Indians, not sat down and had a big dinner with them.
No, we did. Both.
What? So you celebrate killing them? That's the celebration?
No. The Indians did end up all dead, but what we celebrate is the meal that happened before we killed them. Because when we got here, they had things that we wanted, and we had things that they wanted, like guns and drinks, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship. And then, at some point, our needs conflicted. And when needs conflict, most of the time, one person gets what they want and the other person doesn't. So we gave them smallpox on purpose, and then we continued to sort of systematically kill them. But what we celebrate is the meal that we had before any of that happened, when everything was good.
Hitler was popular before the killing. You know, people don't celebrate that.
He didn't have dinner with the Jews. Do you see my point?
But it's, again, one of those sort of intimate comedy, drama, romance films where two people are kind of boarded up in a house together. I recommend it. Low-key, underseen, but quality film. Moving on, 2012. I think that this movie, which I'm going to go ahead and try to pronounce the title. I think it's pronounced the Dodeca Pentathlon. the Dodeca Pentathlon. Yeah, something like that. Duplass Brothers film. I think after Cyrus, this was probably their attempt to kind of take a little bit of a step back. This film, they are collaborating with some of their usual actors. There's no John C. Reilly in this one. There's no Jonah Hill. It feels more like one of their older films. And it's great. It's about two brothers, not a surprise since the Duplass brothers are brothers, and they direct and write all their films together and spend a lot of time together. In ways that are sometimes creepy, as I found out from their book Like Brothers, but that's a good book. I recommend it. It's about two brothers and very competitive with one another, have some pretty obvious relationship issues, and they sort of in secret have this gigantic Olympics, this 25 event Olympic contest between the two of them. And their wives and their mom and people are aware that they're trying to do this Olympic contest, and they hate them for it. So they have to do it in secret. It's a weird little movie, but it's a really fun concept. And I think anyone who has seen siblings compete with one another or get kind of like passive aggressive with one another or try to measure themselves by one another can relate to the movie. I'm not one of those people, but there are people who hate their siblings. It's the thing. Next film, Frances Ha.
Ahoy, sexy. Are you around this week? Ahoy, sexy.
That is actually very gay.
Am I nautically sensual?
You're funny.
Lev didn't laugh at any of my jokes.
You were so funny.
Should I text him back? Starboard anal sex?
No.
Frances Ha is definitely my favorite movie that I'm going to talk about on this podcast. Frances Ha, probably one of my favorite films of all time. I don't know where it would rank. I don't know if that's important. Probably nobody cares. But Frances Ha was directed by Noah Baumbach, written by Noah Baumbach and Greta Gerwig. And I think Frances Ha is really like Greta Gerwig launching herself into a whole nother level. It would be, a handful of years before she wrote and directed Lady Bird, which was an Oscar contender. But Frances Ha is really like, I don't know, in my mind, it's sort of the type of film that I thought Lena Dunham would make. It incorporates a lot of the same themes. I mean, it like Adam Driver's in it, so it feels very girls-ish, but it has a lot more joy and it's a lot more fun than Girls. It's a lot less complicated, a lot less strange, but it's still about, a character who's a little bit socially awkward, who's in that phase in her mid-20s where, she's trying to establish herself and maybe not really succeeding and just kind of tumbling awkwardly through life. But Frances Ha launched Greta Gerwig into a whole other level. I think people who may have known her before and thought she was okay, then saw Frances Ha and were just delighted. I mean, it's just one of those films. It's like delightful. It's a lot of fun. And I think it's also a much needed career rejuvenation for Noah Baumbach, who was maybe stuck in a little bit of a rut. Like Greenberg was whatever. It was not especially well received. Like nobody was going crazy for Greenberg. Prior to Greenberg, he did it was called Margot at the Wedding. Another film that was just kind of like, yeah, it was fine. So by the time Francis Ha came out, it had been a long time since he'd really knocked one out of the park with The Squid and the Whale. And I think his collaboration with Greta undoubtedly rejuvenated his career, led to them collaborating on a bunch of films, and led to Noah Baumbach, I think, getting a second wind and making a lot of great movies. Next film I want to talk about it quickly. I'm rapidly running out of time. In fact, I'm over my allotted time. How's that even possible? Next film, Jeff Who Lives at Home, came out in 2011. Duplass Brothers movie. I think Jeff Who Lives at Home is kind of like what Cyrus should have been, in the sense that this is a movie that has bigger actors in it. Jason Segel, Ed Helms, Susan Sarandon are in it. Still maintains a lot of their cleverness. It's still very much a relatively low budget comedy drama about brothers and their relationships with each other, their relationship with their mom's relationship with them, their marriages, their romantic lives. So it's got all the hallmarks and sort of the usual themes of Duplass Brothers movies, but a little bit higher profile since it stars these bigger name actors. A little bit more kind of cutesy maybe than other Duplass Brothers movies. But I liked it. And I think it's definitely better than Cyrus. And I think if you're looking for a more kind of slightly more accessible, slightly more mainstream introduction to the Duplass Brothers, that's a good one. Next movie I want to talk about. I'm racing through them now because I've run out of time. Happy Christmas. Came out in 2014, written and directed by Joe Swanberg. This is Joe Swanberg doing sort of the whole Cyrus, Jeff Who Lives at Home thing by featuring better known actors in his projects. Anna Kendrick is in this. Lena Dunham has a little cameo in it. But again, very, very similar to Joe Swanberg's previous work, but a little bit of a step up for him. And it led to him eventually making a Netflix series that we're going to talk about quickly called Easy, which is a very good series. Well, what the hell? Let's talk about it now. It's very good. It's a little bit disturbing. It's about a series of, relationships, has a lot to do with sex. Joe Swanberg's work is, the word that comes to mind is sexy, but not sexy like, like early 2000s Angelina Jolie was sexy. Sexy more like about sex. People talk about sex. People think about sex. We see a lot of sex. It's sexed up. Yeah, sexed up. Easy. Interesting little series. The thing that sticks out in my mind about Easy is there's a storyline about a husband and a wife, and they decide to have an open marriage where they're gonna have sex with other people, and it's it's a nightmare. There's just like this moment where, a little bit of a spoiler alert, but they both sort of go out one night and they're gonna pursue other sexual relationships with people. And the husband kind of can't quite go through with it. There's this woman who's interested in him, but he feels weird about it, so he just kind of goes home. But the wife goes out and just has ferocious sex with this gigantic man. And there's just really uncomfortable, like cutting back and forth to this gigantic man just like pounding her. And the husband's at home just like sitting there watching TV, and you're like, Jesus Christ. Easy definitely convinced me that I don't want an open marriage. A couple other films I want to talk about quickly. Creep. Creep is a found footage horror movie. It was sort of co-written and stars Mark Duplass, directed by Patrick Brice, who very talented director, whose work has been very different from one another. He did Creep and Creep 2. He also did, I believe it's called The Overnighters, a really fun comedy with Jason Schwartzman and some other people where two couples are at a house for the night, and the one couple realizes that the couple hosting them are swingers. But it's a really fun movie. Highly recommend it. But anyway, Creep and Creep 2 are, in my opinion, really clever found footage films that subvert a lot of expectations. And one of the things I like most about Creep 2 is it goes in the exact opposite direction that you would think a series like this would go in. If you think of other found footage horror franchises like Paranormal Activity, or say the Blair Witch Project is a weird example because the second film wasn't really found footage. But anyway, you expect these types of films to go in a certain direction, and Creep 2 really subverts a lot of it. In Creep 2, it's almost like the situation's reversed. It's almost like the guy who's the villain, who's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but the killer in the first film is now maybe being played by the person who's filming him. Whereas in the first film, he's playing the person who's filming him. But they're great. They're very unique found footage horror films. Best found footage horror movies I've seen in a long time. Primarily because they use found footage very organically. It's not used as a gimmick. Like, the found footage makes sense according to the story and the characters who are in the story. Highly recommend Creep and Creep 2. We're going to wrap this up. We'll mention briefly Mistress America. It was the follow-up to Frances Ha. Noah Baumbach directed. Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach wrote it. Greta Gerwig stars in it. It's a good film. Go watch it. That's all I got to say about it. And then lastly, Togetherness, Duplass Brothers HBO series. One of two shows that they have on HBO. I haven't seen the other one. Togetherness is kind of like the quintessential Duplass Brothers project, I think. It stars Mark Duplass, stars a lot of actors who have worked with them before, stars a lot of the usual Mumblecore folks, but it's definitely more accessible. It's definitely a little bit less strange, a little bit more grounded, maybe than some of, like a film like Baghead or even Jeff Who Lives at Home. Probably the most accessible and likely the most popular work that they've done thus far. I think it was recently canceled, which is sad. And but the seasons that exist are great, and you should go watch them. Great writing, great acting. I didn't know Amanda Peet was such a great actress, but she is in Togetherness. And Togetherness is a good way to wrap it up, because it's like the pinnacle of this whole Mumblecore movement. Mumblecore started, I guess, over a decade ago. And it was this very low-budget DIY, everybody kind of chipping in as actors, writers, directors, producers, gaffers, whatever the hell was needed on set. And now a lot of these people have hit mainstream success. But they've brought, I think, a lot of their values, a lot of their sensibilities with them. Even though they're now on HBO, instead of doing these micro-budget films in a van, they still have a lot of the same themes, a lot of the same style, a lot of the same stories. And I just love Mumblecore movies. I think that it's the only real American film movement we've had since at least the 1990s. You could maybe say in the 1990s that we kind of had a movement with Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson and Sofia Coppola, Spike Jonze, people like that. But they were relatively loosely affiliated, and they didn't collaborate on each other's films the way that the Mumblecore people do. And one of the things I love most about Mumblecore films is I think they're inspiring. I think you watch a Mumblecore movie and think to yourself, I can do this. I can come up with a really clever idea. I can utilize the people and places around me, and I can go out and make a charming little indie movie. Is that actually true? Can you actually make a charming indie movie? Probably not. It's hard to do, but it's inspiring nonetheless. And I think the Duplass brothers are probably the most inspirational of this group. And I love the fact that, I was reading an article about how they've essentially established this little home/production company in California, and they've started executive producing projects. Like they executive produced the Netflix docuseries recently. And I love the fact that they have they're sort of using whatever influence they have to get other people's projects financed, and they're still not afraid to make little indie movies and jump in front of the camera and produce or act or write or direct or do whatever needs to be done. I find that to be very inspiring. And I think the vast majority of independent filmmakers nowadays, but even historically, as soon as they make a movie that catches on, next thing you know, they're doing like a Marvel movie, you know, and then it's pretty much over, you know, like then they become someone with a gigantic house and a mortgage, and they live in Beverly Hills, and it's like a whole thing. It seems like a lot of the people in this Mumblecore movement have stuck to their values more than most independent filmmakers. They haven't used fame and success to just launch off into making enormous blockbuster studio films, but instead they've continued making the projects that they really want to make. And even though they've graduated to HBO or Netflix or whatever, they're still the same people, more or less, making the same kind of films. And I love that, and I admire that. That's it. I'm done. I went over my allotted time, but that's okay. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully you didn't fall asleep. If I did help you fall asleep, that's good too. I'll contribute to your life in whatever positive way I can. And thank you for listening. This has been the Postcast Podcast, first solo episode, hosted by me, Jonathan Norcross. I imagine the next episode we release will be the four of us, probably. But who knows? It could be three of us. It could be two of us. It could be nothing. It could just be an hour of silence, of room tone. You never know what's going to happen. But thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Next time on the Postcast.
I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger.
This has been a J3 Filmworks production.